The numbers kept dropping on the elevator display. Ground floor, -1, -2. Something was wrong. This building only has 15 floors above ground. No basement levels, no subfloors, nothing below. But tonight, something changed. The elevator was taking us somewhere that shouldn't exist. Somewhere deep underground. And as we descended into the darkness, we realized we weren't alone in that elevator shaft. It started as a routine maintenance call. James and I were checking the elevators at Grand Towers, one of the city's most prestigious high-rises. What most residents don't know is that this building stands on the grounds of an old hospital. While reviewing the original blueprints, we found something strange: sealed basement levels that weren't supposed to exist. Even more disturbing? The night security guard who first reported the elevator problems quit last month, without any explanation. The diagnostic logs showed something impossible. Every night at midnight, the elevator was making trips to floors that didn't exist. We checked the security footage and saw the doors opening to nothing but an empty shaft. Except it wasn't empty. In those midnight recordings, the shaft seemed to stretch endlessly downward, far deeper than the building's foundation. None of the sensor readings made any sense. The elevator was registering temperatures well below freezing and the depth gauge showed the elevator descending hundreds of feet below ground level. But that's when we heard it. A whisper coming through the elevator's emergency speaker. A voice asking for help from somewhere far below. We had to investigate, so James and I entered the elevator for what should have been a routine inspection. Everything seemed normal at first. The gentle hum of machinery, the smooth descent. But then the lights flickered and the elevator shuddered. The temperature plummeted so quickly we could see our breath in the air. The display panel started showing impossible numbers, flashing sequences that made no sense. -87, -156, -342. That's when we heard it. A deep, mechanical grinding from somewhere far below, but mixed with something else. Something that sounded almost organic, like breathing. Our radio crackled to life, but instead of static, we heard fragments of what sounded like old hospital announcements. Paging doctor. Morris to ward. C. Patient requires immediate. The voices were distorted, distant, as if echoing through decades of time. The elevator's descent suddenly accelerated. We could feel the G-force pulling at us as we dropped faster and faster into the darkness. I reached for the emergency stop, but my hand froze midway. There, on the frosted glass of the elevator wall, a handprint was materializing, but it wasn't being made from our side of the glass. The buttons stopped responding. Every attempt to call for help failed. Our radio now picked up more voices, clearer this time. The patients in the lower ward are showing remarkable progress. Dimensional therapy is exceeding expectations. These weren't recordings. These announcements were happening now, somewhere in the depths below us. We checked our phones, no signal, but the time was wrong. According to our devices, we'd been in the elevator for over 3 hours, but that was impossible, wasn't it? The air grew colder still, and that organic sound grew louder, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from all directions at once. The elevator walls creaked and groaned under impossible pressures, and we realized with growing horror that we were no longer simply going down. We were going somewhere else entirely. That's when James noticed something that made my blood run cold. The emergency certification plate on the elevator wall, it wasn't from the current building at all. It was dated 1947 and bore the name St. Mary's Experimental Research Hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. Looking at the tarnished metal, we could just make out a list of floor numbers. And there they were, clear as day. Basement levels, -1 through -7, with a handwritten note beside them that read, Special Research Ward, Authorized Personnel Only. The elevator suddenly jerked to a stop at floor -3. The digital display flickered between numbers before settling on -3 in a dim red glow. Without warning, the doors slid open. The sight before us froze us in place. A long, abandoned hospital corridor stretched into darkness, lit only by flickering emergency lights. The air that rushed in was stale, carrying the unmistakable scent of old medicine and decay. Scattered throughout the corridor were remnants of the old hospital, rusted wheelchairs, ancient medical equipment, and beds still draped with rotting sheets. But something was wrong. The dust covering everything was undisturbed, yet we could swear we saw movement in the shadows. When we later analyzed our footage, frame by frame, we found something chilling. A dark figure, moving between frames, getting closer to our position with each flicker of the lights. In the corner, we found a fallen filing cabinet. Inside were waterlogged records about something called the Dimensional Therapy Ward. The documents spoke of experiments attempting to breach the barriers between realities, using patients as test subjects. The most disturbing part? The last entry was dated just 2 days ago. The security feed on our phones suddenly sprang to life, showing grainy footage of the corridor ahead. Something was moving toward the elevator. Multiple somethings. Dark shapes, dragging themselves forward in jerky, unnatural movements. We frantically pressed the door close button, but nothing happened. The doors remained open as the figures drew closer, their forms becoming clearer with each step. They wore tattered hospital gowns, but their bodies were wrong, as if they'd been reassembled incorrectly. Just before our camera died, its final frame captured what we couldn't see with our naked eyes. Dozens of figures surrounding us, their forms twisted and distorted. Some partially merged with the walls and ceiling, others seeming to exist in multiple places at once. We weren't just looking at ghosts. We were seeing the successful subjects of those dimensional experiments. People trapped between realities, and they'd been waiting for new arrivals. Panic took over as we desperately hammered the door close button. The old medical equipment in the corridor began moving by itself, wheelchairs rolling backward, IV stands swaying without wind. Then we noticed them, strange symbols appearing on the elevator walls, carved by invisible hands, glowing with a sickly blue light. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost formed on the mirrors. The corridor lights started exploding one by one, plunging the space into darkness, getting closer to our position with each burst. In the chaos, I lost sight of James. One moment he was beside me, the next, gone. I called out his name, my voice echoing through the corridor. When he reappeared seconds later, something was different. His eyes were distant, and clutched in his hand was a hospital ID badge from 1943. The photo on it showed his face, not just someone who looked like him, but exactly him, down to the same scar above his eyebrow. Without warning, the elevator lurched upward. The sudden acceleration slammed us against the floor as we began ascending at an impossible speed. Every system in the elevator began failing simultaneously. Lights strobing, panels sparking, cables screaming under the strain. The walls of the shaft outside were no longer concrete, but seemed to be made of writhing shadows, punctuated by reaching hands and distorted faces. The screeching of metal grew deafening as the elevator rocketed upward, faster and faster. Through the strobing lights, we caught glimpses of things in the elevator with us. Twisted figures that seemed to be made of darkness itself, their forms constantly shifting and melding together. James was mumbling something about the patients and the experiments, but his voice wasn't his own anymore. We weren't just escaping from something. We were being chased by it, and it was catching up. The elevator finally screeched to a halt at the lobby level. When we reviewed our footage later that night, what we found defied explanation. Below the building's foundation, there seemed to be an entire complex of impossible architecture. Corridors that twisted in ways that violated physics. Rooms that existed in multiple places at once. But James couldn't remember parts of our experience. The moments when he disappeared, the old ID badge, it was all blank in his mind. That's when I found something in my pocket that made my stomach drop. Another hospital ID badge, this one with my own face staring back at me from a photo dated 1943. The security logs made even less sense now. The elevator was still making those phantom trips every night, but the destinations were changing. Floor -3, floor -7, floor -15. Numbers that shouldn't exist. Our research into the old hospital revealed disturbing details. They weren't just treating patients. They were conducting something called dimensional therapy. Experiments aimed at pushing human consciousness through different planes of reality. But here's the most disturbing part. When they built this new building, they didn't just construct it over the old hospital. They used parts of it, including pieces of the original elevator system. Just before we left that night, I glanced back at the elevator's digital display. For a split second, it showed -3. But this time, I heard something else. My own voice, calling for help from somewhere far below. "We're going back tomorrow night," the building manager just called. They found something in the old records. A blueprint from 1943 showing 7 sub-basement levels, each marked with a strange symbol. The same symbols we saw appearing on those elevator walls. I can hear the elevator dinging right now, calling us back. Something down there is waiting for us to return.